It's trade deadline day in the NFL, and you may see the Jets swing a deal or two, but don't get your hopes up for a franchise altering blockbuster. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, November 4th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. On today's show, we have our weekly mailbag. Usually we do our mailbags on Wednesday, but decided to move it up to Tuesday this week because it is the trade deadline day in the NFL, and we will have mailbag questions about the trade deadline. We'll also talk about what the Jets need to do as an organization if they want to draft and successfully develop a quarterback. We'll talk about whether teams can exploit a loophole in the NFL league rules to build a dream team coaching staff. All that and more on today's mailbag show. So let's begin. And our first question, John, what do you think the Jets will do at the trade deadline? Now, on yesterday's show, I spent a lot of time talking about what I think the Jets should do. What do I think the Jets will do at the deadline? I would not be surprised to see a trade or two. There's lots of rumors out there about potential deals the Jets could make, about players who could be on their way to other teams. My guess is that the most likely player to be traded would be Quincy Williams because he's in the final year of his contract. He's about to turn 30. He's just not having a great season. He's been banged up. When he's been on the field, he's been up and down. You've seen great plays from Quincy. You've also seen some real misses from Quincy out there. He's kind of, in some ways, regressed to the guy he was in 2021 and 2022. A guy who's inconsistent, a guy who's capable of making the splash play that, really helps the defense, but a guy who's also capable of some pretty bad misses. I would not be surprised to see Quincy go because it seems like everything's lined up against Quincy returning. So this is the type of guy where it makes sense to get something in return for him. And, I would not be shocked if Quincy went to a new team and he found his form again and he started playing really good football. But it seems like his Jets career is near an end. And then there's some other guys out there. It doesn't sound like, based on the rumors, like the Jets are really that interested in dealing Breece Hall at the trade deadline, even though he's in the final year of his contract. It seems like all the insider reports suggest that the Jets are inclined to keep Breece. Now, of course, that could change. You get a big deal offered to you. Anybody, in theory, is available, but I would be surprised if Breece was dealt. Jermaine Johnson's the interesting one because it really feels like there's a lot of chatter about Jermaine Johnson being traded. I feel like that one could go either way. I think a complicator with Jermaine Johnson is the fact he's in the second to last year of his contract. So if you trade for him, you're only getting him for a year and a half. So generally speaking, you would, if you're giving up like a day 2 pick for a player like Jermaine Johnson, you'd want to have an extension negotiated. So that way, you're confident that you're getting a player who's going to be there for the long term. You don't want to give up a day 2 pick for a guy who's only going to be with you for a year and a half. This time of year, it's really difficult to negotiate a contract extension. It's much easier to do in the offseason when you have more options in front of you with how you're going to structure a deal to maximize your cap space. I think that's a complicator, but there is a lot of chatter about this. So, maybe it's possible Jermaine gets traded. And other than that, there's always the possibility of a small scale deal. I mean, I really don't think anybody's going to trade for Nick Folk, but if somebody was willing to give you like a 6th round pick for Nick Folk, I mean, I think you'd take it. I really doubt anybody's going to trade for Tyrod Taylor, particularly because he's injured, but there's some team desperate for quarterback depth. They're willing to give you a late round pick. I think you would probably take it. But I don't think that the Jets are going to trade any of like their 3 genuine stars. And I think the 3 genuine stars are Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner, and Quinnen Williams. Now, 2 of these guys are definitely not getting traded. Those are Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner. And, there's been a lot of I hate to use the term clickbait analysis with these guys, but I've seen some chatter, the Jets should trade these guys. And it's not just from the usual sources. It's come from actual respected NFL analysts. And they're not getting traded. I mean, even if the Jets wanted to trade them, they just signed them to huge extensions. And trading them right now would entail massive dead money hits. Both these guys have expressed they want to be here. the Jets clearly want them here because they just signed them to extensions. I mean, it's just silly to suggest that either Sauce Gardner or Garrett Wilson's getting traded. Quinnen Williams is a trickier one because Quinnen is in his late 20s. He is approaching that 30 years of age number. He's in the second to last year of his contract, and it's not clear that he's going to be here for the long term. I would not be shocked to see Quinnen Williams traded in the offseason. I would be quite surprised to see Quinnen Williams traded today. And the reason for that is something I go back to with Jermaine Johnson, that if you're going to swing a deal for a Quinnen Williams, you're going to want to make sure that he's with you for the long term. I think it goes even more for Quinnen than it does for Jermaine, because most of the projections around Jermaine Johnson are you're giving up a day 2 pick for him. Now, in an ideal world, you don't want to give up a day 2 pick for someone who's only going to be with you for a year and a half. But with Quinnen Williams, we're probably talking about the first round pick coming to the Jets, and probably more. If you're giving up a first round pick, you darn sure don't want to make sure you darn sure want to make sure that guy doesn't leave in a year and a half. And I think that that's an awfully difficult thing to do in the span of a couple hours. I think negotiating a contract extension with a player like Quinnen Williams is really hard to do in the middle of the season, because the Jets would need to give Quinnen's people permission to negotiate with the new team. And then if the deal falls through, Quinnen Williams knows you tried to trade him. So how do you handle the last 9 weeks of the season? It creates an awkward situation. And of course, it could happen. But I think that a deal for a player like Quinnen Williams is far easier to pull off in the offseason when you have more time to do it. And again, when the other team's cap situation is a little bit more flexible and they have a better sense of like what their strategy can be going forward, they understand like how they're going to attack the offseason. So while I do think it's possible, and I would not be for it, I would be against it, but I think it's possible Quinnen Williams could be dealt in the offseason. I don't think it's going to happen right now. I think that it's unlikely to happen at the trade deadline. And I think it's more likely the Jets just stand pat and do nothing than it is they make a blockbuster deal involving a player like Quinnen Williams. I think that if the price is right, you could see guys like, conceivably Brees go. You could see Will McDonald go. You could see Jermaine go. You could see Quincy go. And I think they should look to get anything they can for Quincy. I think Quincy should just go to the highest bidder. But I think that for like every trade rumor that's out there, maybe like 5% of them actually come to fruition. I would not at all be shocked to see if the Jets just stand pat today. And the salary dump with Michael Carter II that they did last week being the only deal that they made at the trade deadline, because I think a lot of the players that are available for the Jets, and I mentioned this yesterday, are guys who could help them in the future. This is not like last year where you had a bunch of guys who were leaving anyway, and it's like you either trade them or get nothing. And in most of the cases, the Jets got nothing. They traded Mike Williams. They ended up letting Morgan Moses leave in free agency and got a compensatory draft pick for him. But the Jets kind of stood pat last year, and I think that was a mistake. This year, you have guys that could conceivably be with the team in the future. And if you're Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji, you want this thing to improve quite a bit in year 2 and year 3. It's a lot easier to do with these quality players on your team. We'll wait and see. And again, a lot of it comes down to the quality of the offers the Jets get. I mean, there are certain players you may not be inclined to trade if all things are equal, but if you just get an offer you can't refuse for a player, you get like multiple early picks for somebody like a Brees Hall or somebody like a Jermaine Johnson, you might be open to it. You might be willing to do it, but we will know soon enough. Trade deadline, 4 p.m. Eastern time today. And, it'll be interesting to see what goes on across the league. We've already seen kind of a flurry of trades with the Jets and with some other teams ahead of the deadline. What else is to come? We'll have to wait and see. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the quarterback position. I've been pretty vocal that at this point in time, I don't think the Jets would be well advised to draft a quarterback early in 2026. I'll explain to you the reasons for that as we continue here on this Tuesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by BILT. Nobody likes paying rent, but if you must, you might as well get something for it. That's where BILT comes in. BILT is changing the game by turning your rent payment into real rewards that you can actually use. When you pay rent through BILT, you earn flexible points that can be redeemed towards hundreds of hotels and airlines, a future rent payment, your next Lyft ride, and more. But BILT is not just about rent. It's about rewarding you around your entire neighborhood. BILT is great, because with BILT, your rent finally works for you. You're earning points every month on something you already have to pay. Whether you're grabbing food at your favorite local restaurant or heading to the gym, you're still earning rewards. BILT makes everyday life feel more rewarding, from your neighborhood to your travel plans. Turn your rent into rewards and start earning points around your neighborhood by going to joinbuilt.com/lockedonnfl. That's joinbilt.com/lockedonnfl. Make sure to use that link so they know we sent you. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue now with our mailbag show today. Our next question comes from Dan, who writes, I have a question about your take that the Jets should not draft a rookie quarterback, essentially because they're not ready to develop one. Is it possible for the Jets to be in a position where they'd be ready to develop a quarterback this offseason based on free agency and trades that they make? Say everything else on offense was the same, more or less, but they signed two impending free agent wide receivers of George Pickens, Rashid Shaheed, Alec Pierce, Jacoby Myers, or Juwan Jennings. Would the team be ready for a young quarterback at this point, or is the issue that you don't trust the coaching staff, so basically no personnel improvements will alleviate your concerns? That's a good question. So my issue with drafting a young quarterback this year, and my issue is, when I say my issue, and when I say the Jets should not draft a quarterback, I mean in the first round. The issue is that the franchise is dysfunctional from top to bottom. And if you wanted to develop a young quarterback, if you want the young quarterback to have his best chance of success, the entire organization needs to be behind him and supporting him. And with the Jets, we have an owner who literally just publicly bashed a quarterback who had a 3-game slump. If your young quarterback goes in, he's going to have rough games. He's going to have rough stretches. And your job as a franchise is to keep his confidence level up. And when the guy who's in charge of the team can't keep his mouth shut and he can't help himself from bashing a struggling quarterback, it makes it very difficult for me to see how this is a franchise that's conducive to developing a young quarterback. And I can't get over, like, it's not everybody, but I can't get over, like, the Jets fans that defend Woody Johnson's nonsense bashing Justin Fields. I mean, you don't need to have an advanced degree. You don't need to have an MBA from an Ivy League school to know that is terrible management practice. It's not just in football. Any business you're in, the CEO of the company should not be publicly scapegoating one employee. That's the sign of a completely dysfunctional organization. And, from top to bottom, I don't think the Jets are in a spot that's conducive to successfully developing a young quarterback. I mean, some of it is personnel. They got to upgrade the wide receiver room. The offensive line's a bit of a question mark. I think the offensive line's been okay this year, but, you've got a bunch of guys who are free agents this offseason. John Simpson's in the last year of his contract. Josh Myers is only on a 1-year deal. Do you want to bring back Elijah Vera Tucker? They've got a lot to sort out on the offensive line. I do think the coaching staff also has a lot to prove. I think Tanner Engstrand's a guy who's very much learning on the job right now. I think that there are positive elements with Engstrand. I think that he's a guy who's developed a playbook where a lot of the plays look pretty well designed, but I think he really struggles calling a game. I think he really struggles game planning. I'm not sure he's the guy to guide a young quarterback through the early stages of a career in this league. And I think that if you're going to bring in a young quarterback, you're probably going to want to change offensive coordinators and bring in someone more experienced, somebody who got a little bit more seasoning, because Engstrand's a guy who, at this point, he's a guy who looks like he's an assistant offensive coordinator. And I think the best proof I have of that is, look how faint the praises he's getting when something goes right. It's like we're praising him for not abandoning the run after the first half. We're praising him for Breece Hall getting targets in the passing game. I mean, it shows you where Engstrand is right now. From top to bottom, the organization, though, needs to be functioning. And I think that's one of Aaron Glenn's biggest challenges. It's kind of difficult to describe. I mean, there's an intangible element to it, but Aaron Glenn really does have to change the culture of this organization, because this is an organization that's too focused on trying to find saviors and trying to find scapegoats. In an NFL team, you have 53 players, 22 starters, lots of role players, big coaching staff, big scouting staff, big support staff. One person only makes so much of a difference. And with the Jets, and this comes from the top, it always feels like the Jets feel like they're one player away. Or all of their issues can be solved by getting rid of one person, whether it's the quarterback or the GM or the coach, and replacing that one person is going to fix everything. That's just not a healthy environment to develop a quarterback. I'm not saying everything has to be in place to draft a quarterback early, but you need to have confidence that the organization behind the quarterback is going to be stable. One comparison I've heard is New England drafting Drake May. And it's true, the Patriots were in really bad shape when they drafted Drake May, but they turned it around quickly. They made some changes personnel-wise. When they saw it wasn't working with Gerard Mayo, they made the change, and they went out and got Mike Vrabel. They went out and got a proven quality coach. Do you have any faith that Woody Johnson's going to be able to do that with the New York Jets? And I'm not saying you necessarily throw this coaching staff overboard. I'm not saying you get rid of Aaron Glenn, but do you have any faith that within the span of a year, Woody Johnson's capable of doing what New England did? I'm not. The only way I would draft a quarterback is if the team was comfortable sitting him until he was ready. And even if that's not year one, the Jets will never sit a quarterback for a full season if they draft him in the top 5. I mean, it's not really done in the NFL anyway, but the Jets are not going to be the team that changes that trend. And that's just the way it is. I mean, I'm hoping that Aaron Glenn can go in with this franchise and restore some degree of order. And maybe the owner backs off a little bit. I think that's really the only hope this franchise has at the moment. But I look at this situation right now with the Jets, and it's not conducive to a young quarterback succeeding. And it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be conducive to a young quarterback succeeding by next year. I don't think this is the type of situation where you can trust the Jets to do what New England did and maximize their chance of a quarterback succeeding the way New England did with Drake May. So I'm very hesitant about the idea of the Jets draft a quarterback, because I think the idea behind it is that this quarterback's going to come in and be the franchise savior. And that's just not a healthy situation. We've seen this over and over and over. I mean, how many people now are complaining that the Jets got rid of Sam Darnold? And they're looking at they're saying, why did the Jets get rid of Sam Darnold? Well, these were the same people that said we're blaming Sam Darnold for everything that went wrong in 2020. In many cases, there's only so much one player can do. And one thing we've seen for certain with the New York Jets is that if you're not in a position to develop a quarterback, you're almost always worse off taking a quarterback in that situation, because then you're tying yourself to a guy who you can't develop and you're committing to him for multiple years. It just does not create a good situation. Our next question, John, do you have any thoughts on Andre Cisco's injury? So Aaron Glenn announced yesterday that Andre Cisco is out for the season, got a shoulder injury. He's got an injury with his pec muscle. So Cisco is out. That means Tony Adams is back in. I think it was a bit of a disappointing season for Cisco. I think that there were some good moments, but he was not the guy the Jets were hoping they signed. I think, Cisco had a rough 2024 in Jacksonville. He actually got benched by the Jaguars last year, but he was good in 2022 and 2023. So, I mean, look, I liked the signing at the time. I thought he was a logical guy as a buy low candidate on a 1-year deal. And I was hopeful that he could bounce back, because while Cisco played poorly in Jacksonville last year, he had good film in the past, and the Jaguars were really dysfunctional last year. I mean, they may have been as dysfunctional, if not more dysfunctional, than the Jets were. So it could have been a situation where just guys who were good players kind of got swept up in that. But there were lots of big plays where Cisco took a bad angle or missed an opportunity to make a tackle. I think that this signing was not a successful one. I think it was really just an overall disappointing signing. This does mean Tony Adams is back in the lineup. I do think Cisco's play was a cut above Tony Adams. Adams was having a really rough season, and now he's going to have to go back in there. And I guess you just hope for the best with Adams. One thing I will say is Malachi Moore has not been spectacular, but Malachi Moore did upgrade the safety play, and he played at a higher level than Tony Adams did. And there is upside there with Malachi Moore that doesn't really exist with Adams right now. So I don't really have anything good to say about the injury. I feel bad for Cisco getting injured. I don't think the signing was successful. I think that he's probably not coming back next year. I mean, would it be the most shocking thing in the world if he's probably not going to make much money, because this was his 1-year prove it deal and he did not prove it. So, would it be the most shocking thing in the world if the Jets brought him back on a veteran minimum deal? No, but I think his time with New York is probably over short of that. And I think that we're downgrading the safety position by putting Tony Adams back in there. So unfortunately, not a lot of good news on that front. You're on the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll turn our attention to how teams build coaching staffs. Now, as you may know, there's no salary cap in the NFL for teams hiring coaching staffs. So is this a loophole that teams can exploit to build a dream team? I don't think it's that simple. And I'll explain why as we continue here on this Tuesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of a game or want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. And it's not just the NBA where you can check out on FanDuel. There's also NFL action. Looking ahead this weekend, the Cleveland Browns coming to MetLife Stadium, the Jets 1.5-point favorites. I guess that win over the Cincinnati Bengals worked wonders. I really did not think the Jets would ever be favored in the game again this year, but after that win against the Bengals, they are home favorites against the Cleveland Browns. You should know that right now, FanDuel is giving customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Tuesday, we're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question: what are the rules about teams and coaches? Could the Jets hire more coaches to help with younger players? Are there limits? Would more coaches help? What do the better teams in the league do? So there are no limits on coaches. So you go to college football, there's a limit on the number of coaches who can work directly with the players. So sometimes what you'll see in college football is there'll be like these staffs of extra coaches. Sometimes they're called analysts, and these guys break down film, but they're not allowed to coach players on the field. There's a cap of how many coaches can actually work with players on the field. That does not exist in the NFL, and there's also no salary cap when it comes to coaches. So, the one idea I hear floated all the time is, this idea that teams should take advantage of the lack of salary cap for coaches, that it's like some workaround to get an advantage, that you just go out and drop huge money on assistant coaches and you build the dream team worth of assistants. And I think it's one of those things that sounds great in theory, but in practice, it may not be like this magical fix to build the best coaching staff ever. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. There is an element of too many cooks in the kitchen sometimes. I mean, I remember back in 2021, during that season, the Jets hired Zach Wilson's personal quarterbacks coach, John Beck. They brought him to help work with Zach Wilson because Beck had a lot of experience working with Zach. At the time, people said, well, that makes a lot of sense. Then after the season, Beck was let go and was not replaced. And the logic behind that was, maybe they were just like putting too much on Zach Wilson. You have like 3 different coaches you're hearing from, and maybe sometimes less is more when it comes to instruction. So that's one element to it. But I think the bigger element to it is a coaching staff is kind of like a team. The pieces all need to fit, and just bringing in the biggest names doesn't always produce the best results. Back in 2019, when the Jets hired Adam Gase, it was pretty much dictated from ownership by a lot of reports that any head coach the Jets had to take Greg Williams as the defensive coordinator. Greg Williams at that point was somewhat of a hot commodity because he had just had a successful run as interim head coach of the Cleveland Browns. And, so they bring in Adam Gase, and they have Adam Gase and Greg Williams work together. And it clearly doesn't work. And, I guess you could say Adam Gase is a bad coach, so that's why it didn't work. But, the Jets have done this over and over where they try and dictate who the coordinator is to a coach. They did that with Rex Ryan and Brian Schottenheimer. And probably the best example I can come up with was the first hire Woody Johnson made for a head coach back in 2001. And, there were two finalists for that job were Herm Edwards and Ted Cottrell. And Cottrell at the time was somewhat of a hot coordinator. He was kind of like a hot coaching candidate. Herm Edwards ended up getting the job. So the Jets came up with this brilliant idea. Well, why don't we bring in Herm Edwards as head coach and Ted Cottrell as defensive coordinator? And that's the best of both worlds. And doesn't that make sense? If you can't decide between two coaches, why not bring them both in? Well, they did that. The problem was that Herm Edwards and Ted Cottrell had very different defensive philosophies. Herm Edwards came from the Tony Dungy coaching tree, which is very much an attack, aggressive style defense, a 4-3 front. Cottrell had a completely opposite philosophy. He was a 3-4 guy, a lot of read and react, less being aggressive, more reading the play, being patient. And the defense they put together was kind of like the worst of both worlds. It just didn't really mesh. And Cottrell had 3 very shaky seasons before the Jets finally let him go. And they brought in Donnie Henderson, who ran a defense more aligned with what Herm Edwards wanted. And I've always looked back. I always felt like Donnie Henderson was one of the most underrated coordinators the Jets ever had. And he never really went on to like have any big jobs after that. I think he was briefly Detroit's defensive coordinator, but I always thought he was a really solid coach. But that's an example. And like coaches have different philosophies. Some coaches like to teach technique differently. So you have two. If you bring in like 2 big name coaches, they may have very different ideas on how you teach technique. And if you have big name coaches, they'll have big egos and they may clash over that. So it's more important to have pieces that fit you guys who work well together. And that's not something that usually requires you to spend a ton of money on your assistant coaching staff. I mean, look, if you can get a great coordinator, it just costs a little bit more money, you should do it, but you need to make sure that that guy's vision aligns with what the head coach has. So I don't think money should ever be an obstacle to hiring a quality coach, but I don't think it's a magical cure to build a dream coaching staff. I think that it's a little bit oversimplistic to think just adding more coaches automatically makes things better, because sometimes less is more. And it's also important to remember that a coaching staff is a team. And just as with players, the most talented teams don't always win the most games if the pieces don't fit. I think the same is true with coaches as well. Our next question. I think one big lesson Glenn and Muji need to take away from this year is they cannot just coach people up. Glenn came in with a philosophy that he can get the best out of every player with his coaching. However, it seems like Brandon Stevens is starting to prove it can work with some players. How does this regime strike a balance between high ceiling and high floor players? One thing I would say is I'm a little hesitant to read too much into Glenn talking about that. I think sometimes coaches just try and put a positive spin on a situation. Glenn inherited a team that was in a bit of a salary cap crunch because of everything that went on in the Rodgers years. So I think Glenn knew taking the job. I mean, how could he not know that the first year they would not be able to do much? So instead of just saying, it's at some point, like a coach can't just say, this team's going to stink. Our philosophy is just, we're going to be bad this year. We're not going to bring in any good players. I think that's kind of like, I think Glenn's saying that's kind of coach speak, where he's just, he knows deep down that like it can't work. I mean, it's kind of like when you hear him defend Justin Fields after a terrible performance. And what's he going to say? Justin stinks? Like, that's what the owner says. And the owner's getting rightly criticized for it. So, I think sometimes coaches say stuff and it's not really how they feel. It's just more, they know that there's no good, they're for the short term, at least, there's really no good way to operate. You just have a lot of bad options, so you just do your best with that. I think going forward, this coming year, the Jets will be much more aggressive in free agency than they were in 2025 because they'll have more cap space, they'll have more resources at their disposal. But to the question, how do you differentiate? I mean, I think that's kind of like the essence of scouting. You have to find guys who have skill sets that you think you can develop. You need to find out whether these guys are hard workers, whether they're team players. And that's just stuff you find out by speaking to people close to them. It's what separates, I think in many ways, it's what separates the good teams from the bad teams. And I think part of it is having a vision for how you utilize players. A guy like Garrett Wilson is going to work in any system, in any role imaginable. The top guys will have such diverse skill sets that they'll be great anywhere. I mean, think back to last year. Think about like all the talk about, Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson, how Garrett Wilson's not a typical Aaron Rodgers receiver, about how they were having a tough time getting on the same page. Despite all that, Garrett Wilson still had 1,000 yards. So a bad Garrett Wilson season, a season where Garrett Wilson's not in sync with the quarterback, still ends at 1,000 yards. Most other players have a much more limited skill set. And that means that there's only like certain things they can do, and there are certain things they can't do. And good coaching and good scouting, they figure out ways to put players in positions to take advantage of the skills that they have. And they figure out ways to avoid putting guys in roles that they cannot handle, that their skill set is not built for. I mean, if you go back, and it's really tough to remember a day where Bill Belichick was viewed as a great coach based on what's happening in North Carolina. But that was one of the best things Belichick did in New England, is he always figured out how to adapt his system to fit the skill sets his players had. And he always had limited guys with limited skill sets who were better in New England than they were anywhere else. And I know you could say it's Brady, but it was true on defense too. I mean, Belichick did that on defense as well. So it clearly wasn't all Brady. And that was one of the contributing factors to the Patriots dynasty. Not every coach can do that. So, I mean, that's one of the qualities that sets apart scouting. It's one of the qualities that sets apart coaching. Who's good versus who's bad. You have to figure that stuff out. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.